And we have this breaking news on the embattled Navy SEAL fighting to keep his rank in the elite unit with the support of the president. Let's go to NBC White House correspondent Hans Nicolle, who's joining us right now about that. What are you hearing about this, Hans?
Well, Eddie Gallagher is once again making his case on Fox News. He was on this morning at 7:30, and a lot of people might have found out about it because the president actually tweeted President Donald Trump trying to draw attention to this case. Here's where we think we stand, Alex. There appears to be a bit of a stalemate. That's after the Thursday tweet where President Donald Trump strongly suggested that the Navy shouldn't take away his trident pin, his ability to retire as a SEAL. The issue is that the Navy, and there's been some reporting on this by NBC and others, that the Navy Secretary, Richard Spencer, considered resigning over this. And then there's a conversation late on Thursday where Spencer thought he had at least some sort of agreement from the White House that they wouldn't issue a formal order, or that unless a formal order were issued, he wouldn't take the president's tweet as a lawful order. Now, about all the talk about him resigning, he addressed that this weekend at a conference in Halifax, and have a listen.
There seems to be rumors out there that I threatened to resign. I have not threatened to resign. I am here. I work at the pleasure of the president. We've made great strides at the Navy Marine Corps team over the last 2 years. There's still quite a bit to do, and I hope to contribute going forward.
Now, you may remember Richard Spencer because Richard Spencer, for a time, was actually the acting Secretary of Defense because he is Senate confirmed. There's a lot of operational and, more importantly, personnel matters that he has to deal with. Now, when we get to what Gallagher's case is, number one, he's very thankful to the president, but he is also accusing his entire chain of command of insubordination for not listening to what the president is saying. So listen to him on Fox earlier today.
I don't know how many times I thank the president. He keeps, stepping in and doing the right thing. And I want to let him know that the rest of the SEAL community is not about this right now. They all respect the president, and what the admiral is doing, showing complete insubordination, is not the good example of good order and discipline.
So what Gallagher actually wants, Alex, is he wants to retire just at the end of this month, and he wants to retire as a SEAL. The issue is, will there be this review board that will decide to kick him out of the SEALs so he retires with a bit of a blemish on his record? That's where things stand right now. I think we need to watch the president's Twitter feed, but also importantly note, if the president issues what the Pentagon perceives to be a lawful order, if he does something more formal than Twitter, how the Pentagon then responds. Alex?
So I just want to be clear. Is the president supportive of this inquiry going forward? Is he going to allow it, or is he trying to put a stop to it, or is this all still trying to be figured out?
I think we're at a stalemate. I think we don't know. We don't know what the president's next move is going to be, whether it's going to be something official, it's going to be on Twitter. We know what the Pentagon seems to think, what Richard Spencer seems to think. But if the president's touting these interviews in the morning, I don't think we've heard a presidential response to what Gallagher said earlier this morning. And Gallagher was clearly asking for one more appeal because, remember, the president actually commuted his sentence as well. So
he did indeed. You're right. OK, Hans Nicolle from the White House. Thank you for that.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.